in many ways, it's important to talk about prayer, and we will be just, thinking a little more about the Lord's Prayer in our intercessions. But I want to go through Hosea with you because it's such a difficult book, and just because it's difficult doesn't mean we don't need to deal with it. Martin Luther famously said that the Old Testament was the swaddling bands of Jesus. And as if, within the Old Testament, we will find Jesus. The difficulty is sometimes it's difficult. Um, and yet we will never fully understand Jesus until we deepen our understanding of this bizarre collection of writings, which is what we call our Old Testament. So, as a bit of background to this, I want to just nip through the story so far when we get to Hosea. So, starting at the very beginning, remember, God creates humans and blesses them to be God's image in the world and to therefore bless the world in turn. But of course, they decide that they'd rather choose for themselves right and wrong and good and bad than follow the Creator's ideas. And because of that, chaos descends on the world and disaster. God starts again choosing one man and woman, this time Abraham and Sarah. And once again, he blesses them and he promises through a covenant to work with them so that they and their descendants can be a blessing to the world. So they and their descendants mess up in multiple ways and end up in Egypt. Generations later, they're a whole nation, and their numbers threaten the Pharaoh who makes them into slaves. As you all know, enter Moses, the plagues, and the exodus through the Red Sea to the desert. There, God blesses them and makes a covenant to work with them so that they and their descendants can be a blessing to the world. This should be sounding familiar to you by now. They grumble and moan and are so unfaithful that they end up in the desert for 40 years before they finally make it to the promised land. But even when they make it, they are anything but a blessing to the world. The book of Judges is a hideous book to read because it's a chilling description of what a nation can become and do when, as it says repeatedly through that book, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. In other words, repeating the original sin of Adam and Eve. So eventually God allows them a king so that they have an earthly ruler who can say what's good and bad, since they pay very little attention to their real king, God. And in particular, he blesses David, the shepherd king, and makes a covenant with him so that he and his descendants can be a means of blessing to the world. God just never gives up. No matter how often it doesn't work, God doesn't give up. Now, some kings were okay, some were disastrous, and over decade after decade, the Hebrew people swung between some kind of half-hearted attempts to follow God and being lured off by other beliefs and practices, choosing, in fact, to ignore God and all the laws and rules for life and guidance to a just and fair society that God had given them. And some of the practices they took up from surrounding religions were appalling, things like child sacrifice. So God tries another way. And this is where the prophets arrive. So Elijah, Elisha, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Hosea, all those little books at the end of the Old Testament with unpronounceable names, they're all God's instruments to try to wake up the people before complete disaster hits. The nation's already become such a mess that it's split in two. So we've got Israel up in the north and Judah in the south. And powerful nations are threatening them both. The prophet Hosea is in the north, And he knows that the most brutal empire of the time, and possibly the most brutal empire ever, the Assyrians, are poised to attack. You don't want to know what the Assyrians did to the people they conquered, but just know that it was cruel and sadistic beyond words. So that is the threat. Sadly, the people, true to form, ignored the prophets, and the 10 tribes which made up Israel did fall to Assyria and were scattered or destroyed. You know, that's where all the legends of these lost tribes of Israel come from. Judah, meantime, was making a slightly better attempt to follow God, and they were protected for another 135 years. But then they too fell to Babylon and ended up being taken off in exile. As we know, later on they returned, and we get the name Jew from this word, Judah. So anyway, that's the context that Hosea is speaking in. In other words, it's a desperate situation. So when we read the prophets, it's best to remember that they're not giving us a few comforting quotes for bumper stickers. They were crying out to the people to please this time around be faithful to God, listen to God's guidance and wisdom rather than their own, or else appalling tragedy and disaster were going to hit. So because of what is at stake here, they don't pull any punches. Their own language and actions are meant to shock, are meant to wake people up, because this was life or death to them. And so when we get to the book of Hosea, God asks Hosea not just to say something shocking, but to do something shocking. He is told to marry a prostitute, and in particular, to marry one who he knows will be unfaithful. And when she's unfaithful, he has to do everything he can to win her back. And he has to accept her when she does come back, whatever she's done in the meantime. In other words, Hosea is to make a covenant with her, the covenant of marriage. He's then to watch as she heads off, ignoring his love and all he's given her, to seek pleasures elsewhere as if he doesn't even exist. That should sound familiar. Yeah. This is the whole history of God's people. How does God then bring this unfaithful wife back? He tries love. He tries words and promises and guidance. And in the end, he makes life so difficult for her, even allowing her to go off to exile, that she has no choice but to come back. Now, it might be worth at this point thinking of a more familiar story here, the story of the prodigal son. Now, we often think of the prodigal son being remorseful and coming home, but face it, he only felt remorseful and came home because he was hungry, because he had tried every other option, and this was the only one left. And yet, the father accepts him, even on those terms. And Hosea accepts his wife, even on those terms, not because she loves him, but because every other option has been removed. I'm not so sure how many of us would do that. And God accepts God's people, even on those terms. That's the degree of love that God has for us. Now, the important thing is that this story hasn't finished. We've just stepped into it. We've stepped into this same story, starting at the Garden of Eden, going through all this amazing history of God's people in relationship with God. But we've stepped into it after an even more amazing story has entered the flow. Not only one of God accepting back an unfaithful wife, but of God seeking out that unfaithful wife and dying for her. At the heart of it is the same central burning truth, the unfathomable love that God has for us, the unfathomable love that God has created of the human beings that God has created to be a blessing in the world. And the incredible faith of God that God will keep trying and keep hoping that this time we will do it. We will be the blessing we were meant to be. If you think of that famous passage about love in 1 Corinthians 13, we hear it at weddings, and yes, it is about the way we are supposed to love. But it is also about God who is love. Here's one verse. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. God is love. God, in God's love, bears all things that we throw at him, believes all things are possible, hopes all things for his people, endures all the disappointments we cause him. Love never ends, and that's the story that we're part of.